Nuremberg is, of course, part of the narrative about Katyn, racial justice for Katyn. It's the first attempt to prosecute the crime that was committed at Katyn. As we all know, the persons who were charged were the wrong suspects, and they were, in fact, acquitted. How the crime of Katyn was dealt with in Nuremberg. The Soviets were responsible for the part of the indictment that dealt with atrocities committed in the East. Others, the Americans, had the responsibility for the war of aggression, the division, the subject for which the Nazis were being prosecuted at Nuremberg was divided among the four powers who had created the tribunal and who had appointed the prosecutors. The four, each one appointed its own prosecutor. And Jackson later, before the Select Committee, explained that actually he was not responsible for this area, nor was he responsible, in fact, for the carriage of the case that the Soviets had decided that they wanted to prosecute. There was some quarrel as they were preparing the indictment. The Soviets, of course, insisted on including the reference to Katyn in the indictment. Jackson later said that he quarreled with them and objected to it, although I think it's fairly clear from his testimony and from the other reports about the preparation of the indictment that it wasn't so much about a conviction on the part of Jackson and others that the Soviets were actually responsible for Katyn. Jackson explained and gave a number of reasons for not including it in the indictment. He said that, first of all, we didn't need to include it in the indictment. This is something that we can discuss, but he said we already had lots of evidence of massive atrocities committed by the Nazis against the Polish people, and we actually didn't need to add that part to it. He also said, and I think there's a certain amount of wisdom in his remarks, he said it was going to be difficult to prove in one way or another because it was something that was going to require eyewitness testimony. And he said we had very little eyewitness testimony at Nuremberg. Most of the case was actually built on documents. And in the entire trial, on the prosecution side, there were in fact only 33 witnesses called in the Nuremberg case. Most of the case was made on documents. And he said this was going to be very hard to prove. There's an interesting comment at the very end of the trial by one of the prosecutors, Robert Servatius, who was the counsel to, not the prosecutors, one of the defense lawyers. He was the counsel to Fritz Sacco, his name was, one of the Nazi defendants. And he just gave Katyn as an example of the difficulty of getting to the bottom of the facts when the investigations had been so political. And by the time they got to Nuremberg, of course, you had charges on one side or another from the Nazis and from the Soviets, both of which were profoundly suspect. And nobody was going to easily accept the Nazi Commission of Inquiry any more than they were going to view the Soviet Commission of Inquiry as being entirely neutral and objective and disinterested. So for all these reasons, Jackson said he opposed including it, but the Soviets insisted. Later it became clear that they were very half-hearted about it, and they may very soon have regretted that they raised the issue at all. When they produced evidence in February of 1946, it was confined to a few minutes, and it was essentially the production of the report of the Soviet Commission, which went in as an exhibit for the Soviet Union, exhibit number 50. This, of course, stirred the Nazi defense lawyers who said that they wanted to call evidence to challenge this, particularly Goering's lawyer. And so the judges, with great reluctance, agreed that they would hear more evidence on the case. The Soviets objected. They said that there could be no challenge to their report. Jackson said, again before the Select Committee, that their position, the American position, was that of course the Germans were entitled to call evidence on the other side. And this is interesting, the handling of it, because I think it shows also the profound fairness of the proceedings at Nuremberg. This was not a one-sided trial. The Soviets would have liked it to be that way. I think they thought that the trial might have run rather like some of the trials they had in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. But in fact, the judges and the other prosecutors were not going to let that happen. And so in July of 1946, as the trial was ending, in the final days of the trial, approximately 2 days were devoted to the calling of evidence. Today, when we read that evidence, and I reread it yesterday on the plane flying over from Ireland, when we reread that evidence, we have difficulty dissociating it from what we know today about Katyn, including, of course, the admission by the Soviet Union, by the Russians, that they were responsible for it. But I think a criminal lawyer or a judge reading that evidence today, in the absence of knowing other material about it, and the judges did not apparently have anything else to go on, they were not certainly supposed to take into account anything other than what had been tendered in evidence, would walk away scratching their head saying, I don't know what to make of this. You had 3 witnesses called by the German defendants. The 3 witnesses who testified for the German defendants essentially said, we were there at Katyn in 1942 and 1943, and we didn't see anything. We didn't hear anything about an order to murder people. And while that may be a very accurate account of what they knew, it hardly goes to it's hardly a compelling way to address a problem that's been put there on the table to simply say, we deny it. They did not, in their evidence and with their 3 witnesses, try to set out their case that the Soviets had done it. They simply said, we discovered the bones there, we discovered the remains. They did not, for example, produce their report, the report of the commission that the Germans had set up in 1943, and it's not an exhibit at the Nuremberg trial. Then the Russians came along, and they produced their 3 witnesses in reply. And their witnesses were also weak and ineffective, and I think a good lesson to a prosecutor about what not to do to try and prove a case, because the evidence that the German lawyers had failed to put on the record, including portions of the report that had been of the commission that the Germans had set up in 1943, actually got into the record through the Soviet witnesses. And the Soviets, I think, actually helped to make the case against themselves. But in the end, I think the testimony of those 6 witnesses, 3 for the Germans and 3 for the Soviets, is simply inconclusive. And perhaps it's unfortunate that the judges in the final judgment did not say this explicitly. Instead, they're entirely silent on the subject. But the result, finally, is in many ways the proper one. They were not there to assign responsibility to the Soviet Union. They had no jurisdiction to do so, and they didn't have enough evidence before them to make that step. In any case, it would have been reckless and hazardous, I think, on their behalf to do that. So instead of saying that the evidence was inconclusive, they were simply silent on the matter. And that includes, and then I think perhaps if we ever get to know everything about it, which we surely will not do, one might even say that it may have shown some courage on the part of the Soviet judge not to mention this in his dissenting opinion as well. He wrote a dissenting opinion, and he might very well have used that as the occasion to say that in his opinion the Germans were responsible and should have been convicted, and instead he was silent. And many people have pointed to this, saying how that shows the nature of the trial, really, when it came to dealing with Katyn.